Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Marion Sargent, President of the Launceston Historical Society, and I welcome everyone to today's meeting. I extend a special welcome to new members and those attending for the first time, and to those out there watching on Zoom. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this event is taking place. Now, please turn off your phones, or down, so we don't have interruptions. And I apologise for all the mixed messages you've been getting, but circumstances keep changing during the last month. But in some respects, we are back to normal, because we're now allowed to have 110 people in this room, so long as you're all seated towards the front. And but we're not allowed. We don't have to keep a list of people anymore, so there is no need to book, and but we still have restrictions on serving food, so we don't do afternoon teas. And I hope you did all find somewhere to park, and we were rather dismayed when we heard the football was on, because we've got this clash. I know some people haven't come because they've gone to the football or they're worried about the parking, so we might have some extra people on Zoom because of that. And also, of course, our speaker couldn't come, but I'll come back to that. Our next event here is on Sunday, the 18th of July, when Alan Townsend will be telling us about his obsession with historic wallpapers. And so before we go on to the main speaker today, we'll draw the raffle. So, now, have you got your raffle tickets out there? Orange, V88. Oh, I think I've got mine. Oh. 88, yeah? Oh. Oh, great. Joan, it's Joan, isn't it? Yes, she's chosen Di Cassidy's book on Launceston prostitutes. Interesting reading there. And the second one is Red F57. Oh, Tom, didn't you get it last week? Or oh, you did last month? Right. Oh, Tom won 2 months in a row, and he's got a nice box of chocolates today. So thank you all very much for buying your raffle tickets. Now, we were hoping, of course, that Professor Alicia Dennis would be here in person today, but because of the Melbourne lockdown, she couldn't come over. So retired anaesthetist Dr John Paull, who's just been awarded an OAM, so he's had a busy few weeks, were presented instead. And John is a member of our society and has researched and written extensively about Dr William Pugh, and is the convener of the Pugh Day Lecture, which is what this is today. And the topic is the role of anaesthetists in safe childbirth in Australia, from pioneers to present day. Now I'll ask John Paull to come forward to present the 9th Pugh Day Lecture, which we hold in conjunction with the LGH Historical Committee. Welcome, John.
Thank you. Oh, I've just opened the same one again. Thank you very much, Marion, and thank you for coming. It's nice to see you all. It's been an exciting couple of weeks for me and my wife. First of all, we got a phone call from the Governor-General's Secretary saying that there was an award on the way and we were to say nothing of it until Queen's birthday. So that, her ladyship had great difficulty. She describes herself as motor mouth. And then on Monday, we had the public notice of the award. Unfortunately, the week before, I'd taken the dog for a walk and fell over and landed on my face on the side of Rosevears Drive. Ended up at the General and had a plaster put on my arm after an X-ray, and then a CAT scan of my head to prove that I had a fracture of my maxilla. And the best thing about that was that it certified that my brain was present. So that's a good start. What's happened is, I think, unique in the Society's history, that the Speaker has been unable to attend and a stand-in has had to take the role of speaking. And what I've done is organised with Professor Dennis to provide me with a PowerPoint of her speech, and I said that I would be happy to deliver it. The topic is a brief history of obstetric anaesthesia in Australia, as Marion said, and pioneering techniques to the present day. But what I'd like to start with is just bring to your attention a grave family tragedy, a family obstetric tragedy which Dr Pugh and his wife experienced, because only 8 months after her marriage and 4 weeks into a pregnancy, Cornelia Pugh's waters broke, an ominous sign. At that age, there was no possibility of the baby surviving. The extraordinary thing was it was advertised publicly in the local newspaper, which is something that you don't see today. The Launceston Advertiser had this message that said, "Birth on Sunday the 29th of January, Mrs W. Pugh of St John Street, Launceston, of a female child stillborn." So it was sort of rubbing in the bad news. But then came good news, because in October the following year, Cornelia realised that she was in the family way again. And on the 13th of May, 1838, she was delivered of a beautiful daughter whom they called Cornelia after her mother. Bad news was just around the corner. On the 31st of December, 1838, that was turned off. I apologise for this. Yes, drop it in a bucket of water. Yes, on the 31st of December 1838, their daughter developed croup, and in an attempt to salvage her spiritual well-being, she was baptised at St John's Church by Archdeacon who had married Pugh and Cornelia. But unfortunately, 3 days later, on the 2nd of January 1839, little Cornelia died 7 months and some days old, which was a very sad event for them. And I think it's quite possible that Cornelia's childbearing days were approaching the end, because they certainly had no further pregnancies that we know of and no descendants. What Alicia said is that she's not a historian, and as this is a short presentation, I've only mentioned a few of the many key people in obstetric anaesthesia in the history of Australia. That's the lady herself in her laboratory. What does an obstetric anaesthetist do? Well, they provide analgesia, that is pain relief, for childbirth, particularly epidural analgesia, which is known as a form of neuraxial analgesia. And neuraxial means beside the spinal cord, so the analgesia is produced by injecting local anaesthetic beside the spinal cord by a variety of routes. They also provide anaesthesia for caesarean section surgery, and this is mostly in the form of spinal anaesthesia. If the woman needs a general anaesthetic, an obstetric anaesthetist will administer it. And what you may not know is that we also often make the decision regarding the administration of blood transfusions when required, and the resuscitation of critically ill pregnant women. Anaesthetists play a major role in making sure a person's health is optimised for surgery, and this field of medicine is being formally developed and is known as perioperative medicine. It's an area where we find ourselves in because of the nature of the work we do, and our objective is to have a patient or a woman having an obstetric anaesthetic in the best possible health. In the time before the early 1800s, the only analgesic agent used to help with the pain of birth was alcohol, which would have been welcomed by many, I imagine, and not so much by others. It wasn't a particularly good anaesthetic, and you had to drink a lot to make yourself unconscious. So it was a huge discovery when ether and subsequently chloroform were first synthesised around 1830s and first used as anaesthetics for childbirth by inhalation by the Scottish obstetrician Dr James Young Simpson in 1847. In his words, it is our duty as well as our privilege to use all legitimate means to mitigate and remove the physical sufferings of the mother during parturition. We're extremely fortunate to have an amazing publication by Dr Janet McCalman about the first women's hospital in Australia, which was the Royal Women's Hospital in Melbourne. She has written a book called Sex and Suffering, not about masochism, as you might possibly imagine. The title is Sex and Suffering, Women's Health and a Woman's Hospital. She's a historian who specialises in historical population health, and the book covers not only the history of the hospital but also all of the societal and healthcare changes since the mid-1800s. And much of the information Alicia has provided comes in from this book. In the mid-1850s, the colony of Melbourne was a bustling town. You'll remember that it was only established in 1835, long after Launceston was established. And two young obstetricians, Dr Richard Tracy from Ireland and Dr John Maund from England, saw the need for a lying-in hospital that cared for predominantly unmarried or homeless mothers and prostitutes. Working with a ladies' committee organised by Mrs Fanny Perry, they established Australia's first hospital for women, the Melbourne Lying-In Hospital and Infirmary for Diseases of Women and Children, which was later came to be known as the Royal Women's Hospital are now simply the women's. The hospital Alicia Dennis works at today. It was in this hospital that Doctors Tracy and Morn used chloroform to provide analgesia and anaesthesia for poorer women who had complications of childbirth. In 1859, Pugh's wife, Cornelia, was appointed a member of the Ladies' Auxiliary. At that time, the Pughs had moved to Melbourne. They left here in 1854. She was appointed as a member of the Ladies' Auxiliary, whose job it was to raise money for the hospital. And in 1859, she and 4 other ladies raised £105, which was a pretty major sum of money in those years. After the first hospital for women was established in Melbourne, many colonies around Australia built lying-in hospitals. There was this one in Brisbane. I've lost my little red dot again. Anyway, you can see it's labelled Lying Hospital in Brisbane in the middle picture, Melbourne's Lying-in Hospital, and on the right, the Queen Victoria Maternity Hospital, which opened its doors in 1897 in Launceston and has undergone a number of transformations since then. In many ways, history has been kind to anaesthesia, and we have an amazing museum, the Geoffrey Kay Museum in Melbourne, the creation of which I'll talk about later. And many of the pictures used in this presentation come from this museum, including the one right at the top. This museum won an Archival Survival Award in the 2017 Victorian Museum Awards, and is definitely worth a visit if you're going to Melbourne. It's really a quite spectacular museum. You just ring and they will tell you when it's open, and you can go and have a walk around and somebody will explain what you're seeing. Initially, chloroform was simply dripped on a handkerchief held over the mother's face to form a small tent. And I discovered recently, to my surprise, that Charles Darwin actually gave his wife chloroform during the delivery of her 4th child. She had had such a terrible labour that Darwin almost collapsed with distress at the pain that she suffered and was determined that it wouldn't happen again. So we progressed from the handkerchief held over the face to a mask, and this is Murray's chloroform mask from 1868 from the Geoffrey Kay Museum. It was used to administer chloroform to women with complicated births in Australia in the mid to late 1800s. Normally, a piece of gauze was pasted over the patient's face with a hole in the middle for the nose and mouth. A metal frame supported a cloth tent over the mask, and the ether was dripped onto it from a small bottle held in the hand. Despite being effective for pain relief and to enable surgery to occur in a pain-free manner, problems with chloroform began to emerge, with deaths during anaesthesia occurring in 1 in 3,000 to 1 in 6,000 people. And it started to become less popular in obstetrics. In 1848, a young girl receiving chloroform for a simple operation of removal of an ingrowing toenail died during the induction of the anaesthetic, and she became famous worldwide as being the first person to die from the use of chloroform. But women still needed, wanted and demanded pain relief, and the era of twilight sleep began. There was even a twilight sleep society or association. This was a portable hypodermic kit which contained a syringe, needles, and those little tubes which contained morphine, atropine, scopolamine, and some other drugs. Similar ones were used in the early 1900s to administer twilight sleep to pregnant women in labour. And that container actually contained spirit, alcohol, which was used to sterilise the syringe and the needle. And my father had one of these in his medical bag when he was in practice in Fairfield in the 1840s. This was the infirmary at the Royal Women's Hospital, Melbourne, in 1912. And when I went there first in 1968 as a trainee anaesthetist, this is what the ward looked like. And it was full of women, many of them with severe jaundice, who had been having backyard abortions and had developed infections. So it was a pretty serious place. I'll tell you a little tale about the same ward at the Alfred Hospital when I was a medical student in the 1950s. And the Anglican deacon from the local Protestant church would come round regularly and distribute little texts on cards to the patients. And the deaconess was a lovely lady, and she asked the sister in charge of the ward, was it all right to do this? And the sister said, yes, certainly. So she worked her way around the ward. At the Alfred, there were 12 beds on each side. And eventually she came back to the nurse's station and said to the sister in charge, Sister, it's most interesting, you've got a Russian in the ward. The sister said, I don't think so. What makes you think he's a Russian? She said, well, I said to him, how are you, my man, and what's your name? And he said, Opachabich. I actually heard this exchange myself. So that was why she thought he was a Russian. Geoffrey Kay was a remarkable man. 1903 to 1986, born in Melbourne, educated in England, a very wealthy family, came to Melbourne. Their name wasn't Kay originally, it was a Jewish name, but it was changed to Kay after the war. He had a medical degree from the University of Melbourne and a Doctor of Medicine, a higher degree in medicine from the University of Melbourne, and a DA, Diploma of Anaesthesia of Melbourne, and the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons in London. And he decided to specialise in the relatively underdeveloped field of anaesthesia. In 1934, he established and was one of the 7 founders of the Australian Society of Anaesthetists. Over the time, the ASA was to develop special interest groups, and in combination with the Australian and New Zealand College of Anaesthetists, formed much later as an independent body in 1922, this tripartite group was the first to form an obstetric anaesthesia special interest group. The person who became president of that was Professor Michael Pake from Perth, who I'll discuss later in this talk, and he was its first chairperson. The ASA remains today a peak not-for-profit representative body of anaesthesia in Australia and New Zealand, and it has over 3,400 members in Australia, and is a member-funded organisation dedicated to supporting, representing and educating anaesthetists to ensure the safest possible anaesthesia for the community. The next era Alicia wanted to talk about was the 1951 to 2019 combination era, and you'll understand why it's called the combination era, which began in 1951 with the appointment of Dr Kevin McCall, whose picture's shown there, as the first director of anaesthesia and the establishment of the first obstetric anaesthetic department in Australia at the Royal Women's. Kevin McCall trained in Ireland and then moved to Australia in 1951 and can truly be called the first obstetric anaesthetist in Australia. From this first department sprang many departments of anaesthesia, obstetric anaesthesia around Australia, with dedicated directors as well as anaesthetists who now have leadership roles in obstetric anaesthesia in their hospitals. So back to Kevin McCall and the first department of anaesthesia in Australia. I had the privilege of being a trainee at the Women's in 1970, and in 1971 joined the staff as a staff anaesthetist and ultimately became the director for 11 years. Kevin McCall realised that there was a lot more to safe anaesthesia and pain relief management in obstetrics than just sticking needles in people. And he established standards of practice which included antenatal education classes to inform women about what the nature of childbirth was, for those who didn't know. He encouraged anaesthesia administration by doctors rather than midwives. He promoted the use of nitrous oxide for pain relief in labour in a safe way. And from Janet McCalman's book, she wrote, "Throughout his long career, he was never to have an anaesthetic death and was to remain a trenchant critic of poor medical treatment during his life." In 1980, Dr McCall persuaded the Victorian Minister for Health to authorise the establishment of a consultative council on anaesthetic mortality and morbidity. This is a very long set of words to describe a committee which would receive reports from anaesthetists of accidents or other events which occurred during anaesthesia, which could then be considered by a panel of experts, and the general anaesthesia people, or anaesthetists in general, could be informed of what had happened, why it had happened, and what could be done to prevent it happening again. Kevin and the Minister for Health could not agree about the extent to which the council would have confidentiality about the documents which were submitted to it. And this delayed its inauguration. In 1983, I was appointed chair of the council and met with the minister to persuade him that no anaesthetist would submit a report to a body where the information that the body held could be subpoenaed by a court. The minister's response was, I believe, or it was, I remember, don't doctors trust the parliamentarians? And I said to him, I don't think I need to answer that. I think you know that already. And he just smiled and said, OK, I'll fix it. So he did fix it, and the legislation was passed through Parliament with a stipulation that the council's confidentiality was absolute. I remained the chair until 1990. The council then commenced meetings in 1983 after the legislation was changed, and over those 7 years, 3 council reports were published in that period. One of the strange things was that the anaesthetist who took over the role of chair after I retired from it didn't ever mention, to my knowledge, Kevin McCall's pivotal role in the establishment of this council, and I find that a very strange thing. This is a picture of Kevin in his younger days, explaining the use of nitrous oxide, which you would know as laughing gas, through a mixing device that down there, I can't point to it. No. The little gadget at the bottom there allows you to vary the percentage of nitrous oxide and oxygen that the mother's breathing with a maximum of 70%, which was a safe combination to breathe. How many women here have had nitrous oxide during their labour? Yes? Quite a few. A lot of women found it unsatisfactory because to be most effective, you needed to breathe at about 45 seconds before the contraction started. And it was difficult to do that unless you had somebody with a stopwatch to count down for you and say, okay, start now. And then you could get quite good pain relief. But often the pain relief didn't arrive until after the contraction was waning. 1951 to 2019 we would regard as the combination era. And the other pain relieving techniques that were developed during this time as part of a combination of medications and techniques to decrease labour pain and enable caesarean section surgery to occur were caudal, that is, an injection into the base of the spine down near the buttocks. Epidural, an injection somewhere about L4, and spinal, an injection, again, about that era, but a deeper injection. And these techniques allowed local anaesthetic to be injected and pain relief provided to the mother. The term neuraxial is used to describe these techniques because they anaesthetise the nerves along the central nervous system of the body, or that part of it which extends down inside the spine. And during this time, the role of data recording and auditing of anaesthesia practice became important, and anaesthesia safety improved considerably, and at the same time, maternal death numbers decreased sharply. The longest running and most successful medical audit in history is the report on confidential inquiries into maternal deaths, which initially covered maternal deaths in England and Wales for the years 1952 to 54, but has continued since. On the left are details of the first audit, and on the right is the cover of last year's report. And Australia has also followed on from the UK and now also reports regular maternal mortality reports. And I had the privilege of being a member of the Maternal Mortality Committee in Melbourne. Fortunately, thanks in part to very good obstetrics and in part to good anaesthetics, our maternal mortality rate is one of the lowest in the world, with 1 death in every 20,000 births. And one of the components of a medical system that contributes to decreased maternal death and also better outcomes for women after childbirth is the ability of a hospital and a healthcare system to support research. And obstetric anaesthetic research was promoted by Professor Michael Pugh, first Professor of Obstetric Anaesthesia in Australia. Michael Pugh was based until just a few weeks ago at King Edward Memorial Hospital in Perth. He was inspired by Dr Peter Brownridge in Adelaide, who was using low-dose epidural analgesia and epidural pethidine for analgesia in pregnant women over a decade or two before it was used in mainstream practice. From this early inspiration, Mike pioneered the use of the low-dose patient-controlled epidural anaesthesia, a walking epidural, where the mother could walk around while free of pain. It required the dose of local anaesthetic to be relatively low, often with a small dose of pethidine included, and the woman carried a pump with her which provided the local anaesthetic, and she wheeled that along beside her on a stand. Truly a dramatic increase in the efficacy of pain relief and its convenience. So the women didn't have weak or heavy legs, so they could walk during labour. Michael Paik also promoted the use of the combined spinal and epidural anaesthetic, which is used by some anaesthetists in some situations. The kit is shown here in this picture as a way to increase maternal satisfaction with birth and improve pain relief. And he retired from clinical practice this week at King Edward Hospital in Perth. These are some of the pictures from the Royal Women's Hospital taken this week. On the left, the birthing suite room, no longer multiple beds in one long room, no Russians. And the operating theatre, which has a bewildering array of equipment, which looks more like the cockpit of a Boeing 747 or 787 or whatever the biggest one is. Multiple screens for the anaesthetist to look at to see almost every parameter of a patient's body being displayed in real time. And they have also modern anaesthetic machines, which look nothing like the ones that I was trained on. Rapid fluid infusers for treatment with women with obstetric hemorrhage. Ramping pillows. These are to make women who are significantly overweight lie on a little on their side, because if you lie on your back while you're pregnant, there's a possibility that the uterus will press back on the abdominal aorta and obstruct the flow of blood to the uterus and the placenta. Not something that you want to happen. So the anaesthetists always made sure that the pillow went under the left hip so that the patient was tilted, the mother was tilted to the right side, because when the surgeon opened the uterus and the liquor ran out, it ran into his boots, not the anaesthetist. And now, of course, there's a new era, one that we are in immediately, and in which there lies probably, like the start of all new eras, a significant degree of uncertainty. And by that I mean the COVID-19 pandemic era. The questions now and for the future will be, what is safe childbirth in the COVID-19 era? Is it safe to labour and huff and puff with aerosol spread of the virus? Should pregnant women wear masks while in labour? Can visitors be allowed to come into the room, the birth room, for support and comfort of the mother? And how is the baby cared for if their mum is COVID-19 positive? And is it safe to give COVID-19 vaccination in pregnancy? All of these matters will be determined over the coming years. There is a need for a historical project to create a timeline and document all the key people in obstetric anaesthesia in Australia, and this talk's only touched on a few of those people. From the first department of obstetric anaesthesia, the Royal Women's in Melbourne, sprang many departments of obstetric anaesthesia with dedicated directors, as well as other anaesthetists who've had leadership roles in the Australian and New Zealand College of Anaesthetists and the Australian Society of Anaesthetists in the area of obstetric anaesthesia. These people uphold high standards of practice for pregnant women, and to all of you, too numerous to mention in this short talk, I extend on behalf of pregnant women my gratitude for your service, says Alicia. She says that she'd like to acknowledge the wonderful research team she has at the Women's and the supporters of the work we do. And finally, I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and hopefully one day in the future I can update you all on the events of this new world era and do it in person from the luxury and privilege of a podium. And this is a picture of the new Women's Hospital in Melbourne, now just called the Women's, as you can see at the top there. It's in the Parkville precinct, right next to the Royal Melbourne Hospital and close to the Royal Children's. So there are 3 hospitals dealing with adults generally, women in particular, including women requiring gynecological surgery for cancer and other reasons, and children. So it's a remarkable precinct, and Melbourne is extremely fortunate to have that. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer if I can. John.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong. Is it Queen Victoria made it sort of respectable to have anaesthetics way back, because in those days women were expected to suffer, and she eventually allowed herself to have, I think, chloroform, wasn't it?
Yes, in 1853. In that era, the clergy were very powerful in telling the monarchy what they could and couldn't do, and one of the things they pointed to was a chapter or a verse in Genesis which said that women in childbirth will suffer. And they said it's against God to do anything to stop that suffering. For her 4th child, Prince Leopold, in 1852, Charles Darwin's wife had heard about this chloroform caper, and Charles made a lot of investigations and eventually persuaded an anaesthetist who was very skilled in chloroform administration, John Snow, to come from St Bart's Hospital to Dickens' home while Dickens' wife had her child, and she received chloroform. So in a sense she predated Queen Victoria, but Queen Victoria said, "We are having the baby, we will have chloroform." And that was the end of it. And she said, after she'd come round, what a wonderful experience it was to have this sweet chloroform. And after that, titled ladies felt free to demand chloroform when they were having babies, and so eventually did everybody else. So you're quite right that was a sort of major turning point in the history of obstetric anaesthesia. Yes.
Sir, I think the man, or the person concerned, the lady was interested in the Russian, thought it was Russian, but it was actually Polish, I believe. But I will stand corrected if you wish.
Which one?
The lady who said that we have a Russian in your first of your speech, and I think the man could have been Polish rather than Russian.
Oh, I see. Yes, okay. Opacevich was not a Russian name, it was Polish.
Yeah.
Well,
It's a
I
matter-
don't know what's become of the deaconess. She's probably long slipped off this mortal coil, so we don't have an opportunity to explain it to her.
Well, at that time, people may not have travelled as much as what we do today.
They certainly hadn't.
That's my comment.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Well, she did op it.
In the talk, it mentioned the twilight era of anaesthesia.
Yes.
Are you able to tell us a little more? What
Yes.
did that entail? And, were people completely out to it or not?
The twilight era was welcomed by some but detested by others. The treatment involved the administration of progressive doses of morphine until pain relief was achieved, and at the same time a dose of scopolamine, which is a derivative from the deadly nightshade plant. But it's a hypnotic and amnesic drug, so women forgot that they'd had an injection or pain or anything else, and they had their delivery and it slowly wore off. But it was called twilight sleep to make it seem nice and acceptable. But a lot of women felt very disturbed after they'd experienced this, and it was not particularly popular. The Twilight Sleep Association, which began in America and developed a large following, eventually just passed away because better things came along. Yes, there's a microphone coming.
In one of the parks in Launceston there's a statue, and I think it's devoted to a doctor that gave the first anaesthetic in Tasmania.
That's true. That's in the Princess Square, on the steps leading down from the corner of St John and Frederick Street. And diagonally on the other side of the roundabout is the house that Dr Pugh built in 1839, which has now been painted in black and white paint. Quite striking place. But that statue was erected. You would have been here when that was put up, Simon, weren't you? Yes. It was the ASA and local anaesthetists who raised the money to create that statue by Peter Corlett. And at the base of the statue is a little plaque that tells you when it was made and by whom and who the sculptor was. But it's a very good, we know it's a very good likeness of Pugh because we have a number of photographs of him, surprisingly. Fortunately, photography came into vogue in the 1850s, and despite him having left Launceston, he and his wife came back to visit relatives, and he had his picture taken by, who was the famous photographer in St John Street? No, never mind. There is a photo of him sitting at a desk, and you can see behind the chair the feet of a tripod. And what the subject had was something pinning his head to a stand with two things behind his ears, so that he would sit still enough for the photographer to get a decent exposure and a good sharp picture. No permanent injury. Yes?
Whatever is it that...
Just a sec. Let the man bring the microphone.
Why ever is it that the health statistics in the USA are so bad still compared with Australia? You mentioned.
That's a little bit out of my area of expertise, I think. I think you probably have as many opinions here as you'd have people. the performance of the US in the pandemic has been erratic, would be the kindest word you could say for it, in large part due to the former president's insistence that it was only just like the flu and would be gone in a week, and that all sorts of drugs could be used to treat it, which have been proved to be totally useless. So I don't know.
Just as bad though in obstetrics as other areas, just as bad. According to Bill Bryson's latest book, even in obstetrics their statistics are appalling compared to many a country, a so-called advanced civilization.
Yes. I'm not in a position to comment about that. I have been to America, and I was in an operating theatre when a woman was having a caesarean section done by the professor of obstetrics. And it went on, and after they delivered the baby, they got the uterus out of the wound and inspected it and put it back, and then they got it out again and had another look. And the anaesthetist I was with said, how long do your fellas take to do this? This was in just 3/4 of an hour. And he said, how long do your fellas take to do this? And I said, they'd be on to the second Caesar and have the baby out by now. He said, what? I can't believe it. I said, nobody would take this long to do a Caesar in Australia. Oh, he said, Anyway, I don't think that had any influence on the professor and his ability to do a caesarean section, but it was an astonishing experience to watch. So I don't know what the problem is, whether it's one of training or experience, or the holy dollar has such a big influence that people will accept second-rate treatment in the belief that it costs a lot of money and therefore must be good. Let's hope we don't fall into the same trap.
Sorry, I've got to come up here. Yes, that's all right. Well, thank you so much, John. That was really interesting, and it's a shame that, yes, so and there's a little gift for you.
This will relieve the pain of my wrist.
Sorry, the wrong hand. Thank you. That's a gift for John, and John is going to send a copy of one of his books to Alicia to thank her for putting the PowerPoint together. So we've got two people involved today. I just wanted to point out something that came up in that talk about the Queen Victoria Hospital in Launceston. I wrote a story about it recently, so I've done a little bit of research, and it's in today's Examiner. And if you remember, you would have a link to that as well. The picture that was shown on here was in High Street, where the old 1937 building is, and the 1960 building is next door. But I wrote the story about the first one, the 1897 one, was in St John Street. And it was 193 and then 195, but now it's just 195 St John Street. It's worth going up to have a look. And also, in today's paper, they didn't put the photo of what it looks like now, but if you go onto the Launceston Historical Society Facebook page, you will see 4 photographs. And there's the first one, the original hospital, which was a 2-storied house, and then which was opened in 1897. Another wing was added in 1900 on the southern side, and then 1903 another wing was added on the northern side. So you've got a great big hospital, which is now a house. So that was where the first 40 years of the Queen Victoria Hospital was. So that's what I've written about, just the beginnings of that. And I thought that was a good a good day to have it in the paper, just as a to couple going with this. Okay, so thank you very much for that, John, and thank you for everyone who came today. And hopefully we'll see you again on the 18th of July when Alan will be talking about wallpaper, and which should be very interesting, because he doesn't only talk about the old wallpapers, he creates them, and so then puts the new old style wallpapers into National Trust homes and other places. So. And sorry we can't offer you afternoon tea, and leave the chairs where they are, and thank you for coming, and if you want to rush to the football, you've still got a chance.